All right, so we're going to start with a quick introduction to cells for Chapter 3 and talk a little bit about the membrane and the proteins embedded in it. If you recall the concept of complementarity, where structure and function are linked, well, the same thing applies to cells. Most people know what sperm do. They swim up the female urogenital tract and try and find an egg to fertilize. So they have this aerodynamic, kind of fishy looking shape and the tail to propel them. So their form helps them perform their function, and pretty much the same thing applies to all of the other kinds of cells you can think of in your body. Nerve cells carry electrical information long distances, so they have these very long processes so that they can communicate between different parts of the body. So all of your cells are a little bit different, but they all have some things in common. And I like to split them up into these three different parts and kind of use the analogy of a computer, especially like a laptop computer, to talk about what the different parts of the cell do for it. So the nucleus is where all of the information is stored. So it's like your hard drive. Every cell's nucleus has DNA in it, and DNA contains all of your genes, and the instructions for making all of your proteins is basically what genes are. The cytoplasm then is kind of like the desktop. It's what is going on in the cell at that point in time. So which proteins are being made, what kind of metabolism is taking place, that all is what's going on inside the cytoplasm. So it's kind of like what's running on your desktop. And then the plasma membrane, went forward one, is two things. One, it's a boundary, just like your laptop case is a boundary. It keeps dust outside and protects all the parts on the inside. Your cell membrane does that. But it's also the interface with the environment. So if you think about your laptop's got built into it a keyboard to get information onto the desktop or into the hard drive, and then USB ports and other little places to plug in different kinds of devices to get information into or out of the cell. That's the way the cell membrane works. Information and energy and waste all goes back and forth across the cell membrane. So the membrane, you need to know, separates two different watery compartments or aqueous solutions, the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. So it's a hydrophobic or lipid barrier in between what's outside the cell and what's inside the cell. It is composed of these three different kinds of molecules: phospholipids, protein, and cholesterol. We will first talk about the lipids. Primarily, the biggest component of your cell membrane is phospholipids, and they are what give it most of its functional properties. If you recall from Chapter 3, they're built off of this glycerol head group with two fatty acid tails and then the polar head group. So having a molecule with a fatty end and a polar end allows the formation of these phospholipid bilayers here. So you've got this row of phospholipids with all the heads pointed out, this row of phospholipids with all the heads pointed in, and then the hydrophobic tails in the middle. So you've got a membrane that's got polar surfaces on the inside and the outside for hydrogen bonding with water, and then a phospholipid, and then a hydrophobic layer in the middle. So that's the phospholipids. And then 20%, give or take, of your cell membrane is cholesterol. As it says here, it increases membrane stability. The role of cholesterol is kind of above and beyond what we're going to go into for anatomy and physiology. So when we talk about membrane permeability, we're talking about what crosses through the phospholipid bilayer. You're going to see later on that proteins can shuttle things inside or outside of the cell, but we want to focus on what goes right through the phospholipid bilayer and what doesn't. So whatever crosses the phospholipid bilayer, the cell doesn't have much control over. So things that cross are anything that's nonpolar, which are gases are nonpolar. So CO2, oxygen, your respiratory gases pass right into and out of cells. And then other nonpolar molecules would be things like your steroid hormones, your dietary lipids. Those would probably be the best two examples that we care about. And then things that don't cross the phospholipid bilayers, anything that's polar, or something that has a full charge on it like an ion. Ions are our electrolytes. You can probably remember a couple of examples of electrolytes: sodium, potassium, chlorine, calcium. And then polar molecules like glucose, or big charged molecules like protein. Amino acids are also charged. They're not going to be able to pass into and out of the cell. So most of your nutrient type molecules, sugars, amino acids, can't pass through the phospholipid bilayer. This brings us to water. Based on what we know, most people would think that water doesn't pass through the phospholipid bilayer. However, it does. So what you need to write here is that even though it's polar, water does pass through the phospholipid bilayer. It doesn't pass through freely, but it does pass through. And you're going to see that moving on, this has really big implications for how your body works, because basically what it means is that your cells can't hold on to water, and your body can't really direct the water which way to go. So next up are the proteins. We won't talk too much about them. We do need to know there are two different kinds of proteins. These proteins embedded in the membrane are called integral membrane proteins. And then these, like this one here on the outside or this one on the inside, are called peripheral proteins. The proteins can do a number of different things, which you'll find out as we go through the class. They can be transport proteins, like this protein right here has a channel down the middle of it that ions or water or some sort of molecule that can't pass through the phospholipid bilayer would be able to pass through that transport protein there. They can act as receptors, which are sort of like the old antennas or antennas on your car radio. They receive information from outside the cell and then transmit some sort of signal to the inside of the cell. They can also be enzymes, which we'll talk about later. Motor proteins just move things around, and we won't talk too much about that. The cell-to-cell links we will talk about. So proteins, membrane proteins, form different kinds of junctions, which perform different functions for the cells and the body. The first type of junction is called a tight junction, and you tend to find these in epithelia, which line inner and outer surfaces of the body. What they do is prevent fluid from sneaking in between cells. And so you want to think of them as like a Ziploc bag. It's not a really strong bond. You can pull a Ziploc bag apart, but it fits really snugly together, so whatever fluid is in the bag stays in the bag. So you want to think of like your stomach being basically a bag of acid. You don't want that acid to leak out of your stomach. So the cells that line the inside of your stomach will have these tight junctions to keep the hydrochloric acid in your stomach so it doesn't work its way into the deeper layers of your stomach wall and start digesting it. Gap junctions are these guys down here, and if you look closely there, you can see they form pores in between cells. So primarily what passes through these pores are ions, sodium, potassium, calcium, and this electrically couples the cells together. So you're going to see later on that the electrical properties of cells are very important, and cells can be stimulated by electricity. And what this does is allow the electrical activity in one cell to spill over into the next cell so that they're all connected to each other internally. The last kind of junction we're going to talk about is desmosomes. These are strong anchoring junctions that form strong, not just tight, but very strong, durable junctions between cells, or even between, you could find them between the cell and some sort of structure that's outside the cell. So they attach cells together and they attach cells to what we call the extracellular matrix. So you have these strongly bonded proteins in between the two cells, and then other parts of the desmosome attached to what we call the cytoskeleton, which is basically like the framework of a cell. If you've ever seen them building a house or a building, you've got a wooden frame or steel girders that are holding the building up. Well, your cells have a cytoskeleton that holds the skeleton up, and what the desmosomes do is attach the cytoskeleton of cell A to the cytoskeleton of cell B. So all of these cells here are not just stuck to each other, but have their internal framework attached, so that stress on one cell is transmitted to all of the other cells, and functionally they move and stick together like one big unit. So some of the other things that the cytoskeleton does, we just talked about its role in attachment. So cells are linked to each other through their cytoskeleton, which means you can't pull them apart very easily. They also, like the internal skeleton of a building, they give the cell shape and support, and they actually can allow for movement. So if you look at these streaks here in this photomicrograph, are intermediate filaments, and they run like cables across the cell, and your cells can actually load stuff, attach things to those fibers, and then there are proteins that crawl along those fibers and can transport things from one part of the cell to another. There are a number of different types of proteins that make up your cytoskeleton, but for now, even though you can see microtubules and intermediate filaments, just know that this is what the cytoskeleton does. And that, whoops, I went one too far. That is the introduction to cells in 12 minutes. Thanks for listening.